In this episode, we visit Florida. We talk with an advocate in Sarasota about pedestrian issues. Another advocate is working to update traffic signs. Finally, we look at streetlight poles obstructing sidewalks. Stay tuned.
We're in Sarasota, Florida, talking with Mike Lachey. What's the organization you're in charge of?
I'm in charge of two organizations, Florida Walks and Bikes, and we work on the statewide level for bicyclists and pedestrians, and also Bicycle Pedestrian Advocates, which is more of a local organization.
What's your state organization do?
We passed the last major legislation on bicycle law in 2012. Key to that one was we reversed earlier legislation which forced all bicyclists to be in the bike lane no matter what, whether it was unsafe or not. So we changed that, and there are four other changes as well. And that was the last big shift in Florida law. Since then, we've done a lot of things. We've been killing a lot of bad legislation, and both on the bicycle and the pedestrian level. Last year, there was legislation which would have required anybody passing a bicycle to travel at no more than 5 miles per hour. Well, of course, if they're in a car and the bicycle is moving 6 miles an hour or 8, you'll never pass the bicycle. So that's an example of bad legislation that we would kill. And then on the pedestrian level, there's been a lot of issues with putting autonomous vehicles, personal delivery devices, mobile carriers on sidewalks, and granting them a status equal to pedestrians and superior to bicyclists. So we've been working on that issue.
How good or bad is Florida in terms of pedestrian casualties?
Florida, since the 1970s when I started, and probably before then, has always been considered the worst in the nation in bicycle and pedestrian fatalities per capita. I did a study of a 10-year stretch, and Florida was always in the top 3 in bicycle and pedestrian fatalities per capita, and no other state even comes close. You'll get blips on the screen. Delaware will appear, New Mexico will appear, Texas will appear, but nobody is always in the top 3 in both categories. I think it was something like one out of 6 bicycle fatalities in the country happens in Florida, and 1 out of 9 pedestrian fatalities happens in Florida.
What makes things so bad for pedestrians in Florida?
I think that the people in the rest of the country can thank the fact that they were developed earlier. Florida was never really developed until air conditioning became popular. And there was some development, of course, but the big mass movement to Florida didn't happen till air conditioning came around, and that was in the age of the automobile. So motels were a big thing in Florida. This highway behind us, US 41, used to be lined with motels on either side. And it was a transition from hotels to motels. People would take motoring trips. The other thing was the development in Florida was this big mass developments, 4,000 homes at a time on an arterial with one entrance in and one exit out. And nothing inside that development other than residential, suburban homes. And so you have all that traffic, probably like 2 trips a day is the average, moving out of those developments and having to go miles and miles afield to get to their grocery store or to get to their school or to get to their workplace. So Florida, amongst the states, I don't want to state a fact that I can't back up, but it's probably one of the most auto-intensive states in the country. Add to that the fact that Florida was also developed in what I call the dark ages of bicycle pedestrian planning, when post World War II, up until the 70s. There's a metaphor for you. When the bicycle was not even considered a vehicle, and pedestrians were not considered very much either. Pedestrians are always an afterthought, and so there's that. FDOT, our state Department of Transportation, and our state legislature, they didn't think about bicyclists and pedestrians, up until the 70s when things began to change. So, for those reasons, partially a policy failure, but also history, because of the development of automobiles, development along automobile lines, Florida's the worst. Another thing that I would add, and this is somewhat related to the others, is Florida is east of the Mississippi. We had an engineer come down to Sarasota one time, and he said he could not believe what it was like to be a pedestrian. He came from New Mexico. What it was like to cross the street here in Sarasota. He said it was like the showdown at high noon. And I think out west it's a very different story.
So that's more of a cultural, driving culture thing than infrastructure for that part of it.
That part, yeah. Well, yeah, and so there's education, enforcement, and engineering. So the engineering isn't there for the pedestrians or the bicyclists, and also in terms of education, mindset, and even enforcement. When we speak to law enforcement on the state or the county level, they tell us something I'm sure many of you pedestrian advocates have heard elsewhere. We've got more important things to deal with. We've got gangs, we've got murders. We can't get involved in this, and so you really have to push them to get involved.
Where do you go with a problem like that? What can we do to make Florida more pedestrian friendly, or at least less deadly for pedestrians?
Well, you have to adjust your expectations. There are a lot of things that we would like to see. We would like to see, for instance, we passed a law a few years ago that required on limited access highways that were 5 miles or more from any other bridge, that all those bridges include bicycle and pedestrian access. How are you going to have bicycle transportation if you can't cross the bridge, to maybe 200 yards across a body of water, if you have to go 5 miles out of your way? There are a number of other things that we can do also on the state level. This is US 41 behind us here, and it is written in Florida law that if you're a pedestrian and you want to cross the street, you have right-of-way at that intersection if you want to cross, and cars must yield to you. You can't dart out in front of a car, you can't step in front and cause a crash, but if the car has reasonable time to stop or to adjust, you have the right-of-way. Nobody knows this. Not even the police know this, and it is suicidal if you attempt to exercise that right. So that's one thing we need to inculcate, to educate the public about, and we need to get law enforcement behind it as well. And these things take special efforts, and there are grants that have been out there trying to do it, but we have yet to achieve the critical mass on that. Other things we have a problem in Florida with hit and run drivers. I think it's something like 10% of our crashes are hit and runs. Up there in Hillsborough County, it's a particularly nasty problem. Here in Sarasota, it's something like 10% of our crashes are hit and run. I'd like to see proposed the laws with Florida Walks and Bikes, a law requiring that for every hit and run crash, there's an automatic $1,000 reward offered for the identity of the driver by the state. And so that might help. Another thing we could do with that is we have a problem with these hit and run crashes where the car will be located and the owner will be confronted by the police, and the owner will say, I wasn't driving the car, I don't know who was. I leave the keys around for other people to use, so anybody could have been driving it. And then they are exonerated on that because the police can't prove that they were driving the vehicle. Then they're not even charged. I would like to see a law saying that if you are the owner of a vehicle, you are responsible for what happens with that vehicle in a hit and run crash, unless some other driver of the car is identified. I think that would go a long way towards solving that problem. Another thing we could do, we had a horrible crash here in Sarasota where this fellow was drunk. He got kicked out of a beach attraction. He drove he went away briefly for 30 minutes. He came back drunk again, got in a fight with some motorcyclists at the beach attraction again, got kicked out again, drove his car about a quarter mile, hit another car, hit and run, and then he drove up it was on Siesta Key. He was driving 90 miles per hour on a 30 mile per hour road. He left the roadway because he was driving so fast. He ran down a woman named Donna Chen, killed her, and almost hit the dog. The dog was found later on in the ocean, 3 or 4 miles away, swimming in the ocean. The dog was so traumatized. But then his car ends up hitting a utility pole. That's the only reason he stopped. Turns out this 22-year-old driver had 9 violations in 3 years. And they were violations of contempt of the law. It's driving with a suspended license, failure to appear in court, all these sorts of things. But the failure to appear in court did not go onto his driver's license. How do we expect someone who shows total contempt for the law to suddenly become a law-abiding driver when they get behind the wheel of a car? And so I'd like to see more violations apply to points on your license. And in terms of perhaps an ultimate answer, it wasn't with Florida Walks and Bikes, it was with the spokespeople back in the 80s, that we were the lobbyists. We brought in one of the first statewide bicycle pedestrian education programs for children in elementary schools. Basically it's children in traffic safety. It's a great program. It's a wonderful program. The textbook is great. But out of 67 counties in Florida, maybe only 4 have adopted it system-wide. So the thing about that law is if we teach children at a young age, when we can reach them, how to behave in traffic, it not only affects them how they bicycle and walk, it also affects them how they become drivers. But if we're only reaching 4 out of 67 counties, we're not doing our job. So we'd like to see legislation which would expand the reach to all of the 67 counties, system-wide. And you get into a lot of issues with that. How do you force school boards to do that? And do you use a stick or a carrot? And so we want to find the appropriate carrot to get them to do that.
And you mentioned you also have a local organization. What's that organization?
Well, it goes by 2 names. It goes by Sarasota Walks and Bikes on Facebook, but it's Bicycle Pedestrian Advocates. And we work for basically bike lanes on highways. We're responsible for the bike lanes that are coming in on US 41 north of here, and responsible for bike lanes all over the place, really. And also to work on the pedestrian level. And so one of the big issues we fight is we would like to see wide sidewalks. Here in Sarasota, we had some what I would call planners who were working with a fad at the time and working with compliant local developers who loved them, and they instituted a program of maximum density. I call them density extremists, and so they have zoning codes with 0 setback, and buildings jam up to the property line on these narrow little sidewalks. And there's a building over here called The View, which is a prime example of that. And what this means is there isn't room for good sidewalks. It doesn't encourage people to walk. There aren't trees, there's no shade. Florida's a very sunny place. There are no benches, there's no planters. You have the building, you got the sidewalk, you got the road. And things like this happen. You hear how noisy this is, and you can feel the draft blast from these cars passing. This is not a good pedestrian environment. So we work on those 2 levels in terms of engineering. We also try and work on the engineering and on the education and enforcement level as well.
Okay. So are there any issues specific to Sarasota that might be a little different than Florida as a whole, or a good example of what's wrong with the state as a whole?
Well, one thing to remember about Sarasota is this is ground zero for development. Back during the foreclosure crisis, Florida was ground zero for foreclosures, and Florida is a state in rapid population growth. So this makes us a little bit different from a lot of the other places that you'll go to. And so, for instance, 3 blocks north of here, they're planning to build 9 18-story buildings. They're in the process of doing it. So, yeah, we have a lot more of roads being built and buildings being built. And so, again, the issue is in front of those buildings, we want to have wide, attractive sidewalks for pedestrian transportation. We want to have roads with bike lanes, so you can, on the arterials and collectors, so you can have room for bicyclists. And I think those probably are more urgent here, just because of the intensity of development.
And a lot of your pedestrian fatalities in Sarasota are on US 41 that we're next to here. You got the city that might be concerned about pedestrians, but it's a state road. Who do you talk to when you have a state road going through a city?
Well, we talk to FDOT District 1 is who we talk to, and I would give them a grade of maybe B- or maybe C+ on pedestrians. The new Florida Design Manual, instead of adopting standards that we like, which come from designing walkable urban thoroughfares, they said, well, we can't do that. The best we can do is suggest 8-foot sidewalks. And the standards call for much wider sidewalks and with separation, vertical separation between the road and the sidewalks. So FDOT is kind of dubious on it in terms of pedestrians. On bicycles, they used to be better, but now they're kind of pulling back from the universal access of bicycles on all arterials and collectors. They're going to the model of, well, let's evaluate each road in context, and maybe we'll have bicycle facilities on them, maybe we won't. And I think that's wrong. I think that Florida embarked on a grand experiment in the 90s of providing bike lanes and wide sidewalks, and and wide sidewalks to a lesser degree, but they achieved a lot of that on maybe 40 to 50% of the roads, and now they're kind of pulling back. So it's a grand tragedy is what it is. They should, if they just kept forward with that policy, we would actually achieve bikes, safe roads for bikes, and I would encourage the wide sidewalks as well.
You mentioned wide sidewalks. Where can a community go to find guidance on a good pedestrian infrastructure, good sidewalks?
Well, this is my message to the pedestrian world. I have been a bicycle advocate since 1985, and I have learned the hard way that if you don't have standards behind you, scientific standards, credible standards by credible organizations, and you just go in there and say, I'd like to see this for bicyclists because I bicycle a lot, my friends do, policymakers will ignore you. You have to have good standards. And so, beginning in the 80s, we began to use good standards. In the pedestrian world, these are the standards that are the best, and because we don't really have good pedestrian standards, I see around the country. This is called Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares, a context-sensitive approach, and it's published by the Congress for the New Urbanism and the Institute of Transportation Engineers. That's America's 17,000 member strong Civil Association of Transportation Engineers. Now, what makes it great is that they have integrated the pedestrian standards with the rest of standards that you see out there. So this is not something that conflicts with the rest of transportation. And it gives, on page 70 and 71, it gives specific measurements for all types of roads. No matter what your road is, it will tell you how wide you should have for street furniture. It'll tell you how wide you should have for the pedestrian throughway. It says that every sidewalk is composed of 4 zones. You've got an edge zone close to the road, a furnishing zone. Next to that, then you got the pedestrian throughway, then you have a frontage zone. And it's a wonderful, this would be wonderful. And there are some wonderful sidewalks I can point to in Sarasota where they did this. And these are places that people love to walk. But in the pedestrian world, we don't seem to have a coalescence. We don't seem to have evolved around, have come to a certain set of standards. So this is what I say we need to do. If I could do one thing today and get the pedestrian world to start demanding these standards, of course maybe adapted for each state, then I think we'd make a giant step, no pun intended, for pedestrian transportation.
We're in Pinellas County, Florida, talking with Brian Michaels. What's different about this sign behind us than some other signs in Florida?
All right. Well, this is really a story of a state with 2 signs. 10 plus years ago, Pinellas County spearheaded state law change where you're required to stop instead of yield for pedestrians at signalized intersections. Pinellas County has adopted the sign and started installing them, and most of the other counties in Florida and FDOT are still waiting for Federal Highway to approve the sign for the MUTCD.
The MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, why is that important?
That's the rule book for engineers to design roadways.
You got the sign that corresponds with current Florida law that says you stop for pedestrians when you're turning. What sort of confusion is that going to cause when you have all these other signs that say yield?
Most of the signs that are up in Florida say yield for pedestrians. The great news was 10 years ago we got the law changed. The bad news is nobody knows about it. And part of the reason is because of the sign. The sign is incorrect. The yield for pedestrian is different than stop for pedestrian at signalized intersections.
What's the process for getting it approved at the federal level so the states can use it freely?
The federal approval is there's a committee called the MUTCD. They're the National Uniform Traffic Control Device Committee. In 2017, they made a recommendation to approve this sign. It's R10-15A for the MUTCD. They submitted it in January 2017. So the Federal Highways had that information for 2+ years. It's still under review by the Federal Highway.
What else is being done to make intersections around here a little safer for pedestrians?
The good news is that FDOT District 7 just completed a safety plan for Pasco County. Part of that enhancement and safety plan is to enhance intersections on US 19, where they're going to enhance sidewalks, crosswalks, and enhanced pedestrian lighting, which is pretty amazing. It lights up the intersection so that the cars can see pedestrians at the intersections at night, which is a big problem not only in the state of Florida, but Pasco County in particular.
Beyond the intersections, what are conditions like between intersections with sidewalks or lack of sidewalks?
Pasco has a lot of problems with sidewalks that aren't there. Developments were allowed to come in years ago and not put in sidewalks, and now we have this rapid development in Pasco where you're putting up shopping centers and places where pedestrians are going to want to travel, but now they don't have the access because there's no sidewalks. There's roadway, but no sidewalks. So the good news is Pasco has a plan to enhance their sidewalks. They're also doing a lot of enhancements on their trailways. The Starkey Trail, there's an overpass on 54 that's being proposed by FDOT District 7 to cross, or 54 to get to the Starkey Trail, and that's going to really protect the residents once that trail is completed, because we've got a trail south and a trail north, but that big intersection on 54 is not going to be crossable at that intersection without an overpass.
What does Florida have in the way of trail systems? If I wanted to walk or bike on trails in Florida, what's been going on?
Great stuff. I mean, Pinellas County has huge sections of Pinellas Trail. They're also linking up with Pasco County. There's a Greenways Trail that'll connect Pasco all the way to the East Coast. And then we also have the Suncoast Trail that runs along Hillsborough and Pinellas County into Citrus and Hernando, where you've got miles and miles of trailway that runs along the expressway.
So, say a trail that goes all the way east coast. So once they fill in the gaps, I'd be able to bike across Florida.
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Actually, a section of it is about a mile down the road here, off of Keystone Road in Pinellas County. It's going to connect to the Pasco section, and then eventually that'll link through Pasco into the other counties and connect to all the way to the East Coast.
And a place like Pasco County, how do they get input from citizens on pedestrian issues? How does that work?
There's a pedestrian bicycle advisory committee is one of the committees. There's also a citizens advisory committee, but the bicycle and pedestrian committee handles more of the foot traffic or bicycle issues, and then people come to the meeting and maybe they have an issue or they want information about a trail that's being built near their home, so they can come to the meetings in Pasco County.
What sort of issues have been on their agenda over the last few years? What have they been concerned about?
A lot of trail stuff. A lot of trail information, and we just had a meeting last month where they brought up the overpasses for the Starkey Trail for State Road 54, and they showed 3 different conceptual designs, and Pasco has to pick one of those designs to go over the roadway. So the DOT's been very supportive and helpful with the design and implementation of trails.
And you have a lot of county roads, some of your major roads, maybe some of the more difficult ones, like US 19 or state roads. How does that work with the Florida DOT and the county public works working together?
They work very well together. They have to. We have major roadways, state roadways that cut through Pasco County. So they have to work well together because the funding comes from FDOT in order to enhance the roadways, either with lighting or sidewalks. Big improvement they made on 54 was they put sidewalks in on 54 and lighting. There's still some more they have to do, but the big difference was they put the lighting up. And there's a big difference between a roadway that has lighting and one that doesn't, especially in the heavily populated areas.
What's the future? I came back and visited you here in Florida, and 10 years from now, what would you like to show me?
10 years from now, I hope it won't take me 10 years to change this sign. 10 years ago, the state law was changed, and right now I'm still working on trying to get this sign approved for FDOT to use, because most of the intersections that we have issues with are state roads, and that's the big problem. And it's also a educational lessons for the drivers, because when they see yield versus stop, they don't give the pedestrian any room to maneuver. I mean, they just go. But when they see stop, hopefully that'll reinforce the state law, and the cars will allow the pedestrians to cross.
We're in Sarasota talking with Jeff Redding. What's the problem with this light pole behind us?
Well, it's in the middle of the sidewalk, basically. There's about 73 of them down this sidewalk here on Bee Ridge Road, where there's no bicycle lane and the traffic travels at 45 miles an hour and above. The problem is when you complain about this to the Department of Transportation, they refer these complaints to the Civil Rights Division, and they misrepresent ADA wheelchair pass-by standards as the governing authority in the placement of lampposts. Basically, they're supposed to put lampposts in the utility strip, not the middle of the sidewalk.
So just because they meet the very minimal requirement in the ADA doesn't make it a good design.
And it does not make the sidewalk ADA compliant. That only helps people in wheelchairs get access. Blind people use the sidewalk, people with cerebral palsy. They're misrepresenting a small fraction of the ADA as the only governing authority in the placement. And that's wrong. That's called fraud.
So who should be responsible for these light posts rather than just finger pointing?
It's a combination of both the county who controls the sidewalk, the state who controls the road, and the federal government who paid to have the light posts installed.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.